thank you so much, Lucia, and thank you so much, Tobias, as well, for organizing this wonderful workshop. It's it's extraordinary for me to have this opportunity to reflect on the last few decades and to think a bit again about this book that I wrote now 3 and a bit decades ago. I also want to thank all of you for coming. It's an extraordinary group of colleagues and old friends, the speakers, the poster presenters, the audience. I can't help but make you feel very, very good to have brought a group to help bring a group like this together to think about these issues. And I don't take it lightly. I know I'm very, very look. It's a great honor and also a great privilege to be able to look back like this. And I know that I don't think I'm necessarily especially deserving of these honors. But in fact, it's the kind of thing that does make you wonder whether you might be living in a simulation. When you find, oh my God, the whole the world is gathering to think about this book. Okay, well, they tuned up the implausibility parameters just a little, but I really am honored, privileged, and most of all, grateful. And thanks so much to Tobias and to Lucia, especially for making this possible. This book, The Conscious Mind, was, I think I looked up the record. It was officially published 1st of June, 1996. So that would put us pretty well on the 30th anniversary. In fact, I had my first copies in April 1996. So that's when I think of it as coming out. It turned out it was just in time for the first Tucson conference, the second Tucson conference in April 1996. Also just before my 30th birthday. So that turns out more or less to bisect my life into a first, let's say to trisect my life into a first 1/3, second 1/3. If I said that was the second half, then that would sound a little bit ominous. So let's call it thirds. So this was both 30 years into my life and 30 years before now. So it's an appropriate moment to look back and to look forward. This is going to unavoidably be a little bit self-indulgent. There's going to be some, in looking back, there's going to be some, this is on a setting which, hopefully I can make it work. The looking back will unavoidably involve some personal history, and I'll look back at some of that, how the book got to be written, what the background was at the time, say a little bit about the book, and then in the second part, I'll focus on the last 30 years from 1996 to now and some of the progress that the field has made, and then to end a little bit on where we are now and where things could go from here, looking forward. And that's something which I hope to be hearing about from a lot of people here at this workshop. Where did all this get started for me? Personally, I think my first encounter with some of these issues explicitly, as opposed to, I had vague thoughts about, consciousness and the mind for as long as I can remember. But actually encountering writing about these issues, I think it might have been actually Doug Hofstadter's first book, Gödel, Escher, Bach, which drew me in. It wasn't explicitly philosophical work, and especially wasn't explicitly about consciousness, but there was a lot about consciousness and the mind in it. Then a couple of years later, I think 1981, I came across The Mind's Eye, but I think I was 15, my second last year at high school, and I think our high school's library had a copy of The Mind's Eye, which had all these wonderful thought experiments about consciousness and AI and the self that I found very, very stimulating. I ended up taking one philosophy course. I was mostly a math student, but I ended up taking one philosophy course as an undergraduate. I didn't do very well. Actually, I got an A for philosophy of science, but I only got a B for philosophy of mind. And then they gave me a C for philosophy of religion. So, so I got the equivalent of a B for the course as a whole, which was a big blotch on my my undergraduate on my record. But it did plant a seed for me, and I spent those next few years as an undergraduate thinking a lot in my spare time about consciousness and the mind, throwing out my latest theory at my friends. I ended up going to Oxford to pursue a doctorate in math. On the way, I hitchhiked around Europe. I never made it to Bochum on that trip, but it was not. But pleased to have made it back a number of times now. And then to Oxford. And during that time, I really became obsessed by the problem of consciousness, and I started to think maybe I ought to consider switching fields from math to philosophy. A lot of people thought this was a little crazy since I had no track record in the area, but I ended up going to the philosophy department at Oxford and saying, well, what would it take to do this? And they said, well, you'd have to write a couple of philosophy articles to show that you know what you're doing. So actually, I went back to try and find what I came up with back then. Here was some. So this is my first ever serious attempt at writing a philosophy article in December 1987, which I think you can see as a antecedent to some of the ideas in the conscious mind. Was consciousness the first person and third person view, no mystery from the third person. The most interesting and most difficult philosophical problems arise when we take the first person or subjective view. How could it be there's a being which experiences this consciousness? So, okay, little antecedents of the hard problem. Of course, zero originality in any of that. Any number of people. Oh, what is the interesting noises that Siri? You have opinions about this after all these years? Okay, maybe if I turn the Wi-Fi off, this would be smart. Okay, it's not even the Wi-Fi. Okay, okay, I went a little further into the core of this paper, and actually here is the key passage of the paper. A lot of this is about the question of whether beings who are physically, functionally like us and displayed signs of intelligence would necessarily be conscious. At this point, I took on this thought experiment. Imagine that it was possible for a human being that is a creature physically the same as a human, which behaves like a human, not to be conscious. That is, not in so many words, but that's basically a zombie. And I go on to actually give an argument that zombies are not possible. I actually go on to give an argument that zombies are impossible, that the whole idea is contradictory. Or at least that you get a contradiction when you conjoin the claim that there's a non-conscious human that's behaviorally like us, and that there's a convincing solution to the mind-body problem. It had something like to do with the fact, well, that being would have to be convinced by it, but they could never become convinced by it if they were functionally like us, or at least like me. So there ends up being a contradiction, and one of the two following statements must be true. Anyway, I won't go into the details, but I was already a little obsessed by this zombie question at this point. Although I think the argument there does not work, alas, but worth thinking about. I also had to submit two papers. There was another one on the idea of pattern and information, which is an antecedent of the information ideas in the conscious mind. But around this time, I also, I considered studying philosophy at Indiana, but I also, after having written these articles, I thought, okay, I wonder what Hofstadter would think about this. So I sent him copies of these articles, and he wrote back very nicely. He said, yeah, thank you for your letter. It's 2 papers. I've read them all. You say smart being is necessarily consciousness is undeniable, whereas there can be no convincing solution to the mind-body problem is less so. For me, I'd say it's reverse. I tend to believe too, and to believe that nothing is conscious in this first-person sense. Consequently, I tend to believe the Gödelian analogy you state so well on your papers. That's a very nice statement of strong illusionism by Doug Hofstadter. I see Keith nodding along, nodding along with enthusiasm. So I ended up, packing my bags and moving to Indiana to do a PhD in philosophy and cognitive science. I mean, this was a wonderful experience for me. I learned so much philosophy in my 4 or 5 years at Indiana. I learned so much cognitive science. I learned so much AI. It was just extremely formative for me, and Doug Hofstadter's lab was just a great place to be thinking about all these issues. For a long time, I mean, a lot of my work around that time was on AI and neural networks, which were undergoing one of their periodic renaissances. A lot of people said, "Oh, come on, you should really work on this. Consciousness, that's a dead subject, and nobody really takes that seriously. Maybe a few philosophers and a few cognitive scientists, but the thought was it was a bit of a dead subject." I remember around that time noting that there seemed to be remarkably few books on consciousness. There were this was 1989 or so. There were a few articles here and there, research programs, but not much at all in the way of books. Of course, that eventually that changed, and even at that time, to be fair, there were a lot of philosophers, scientists, and others already thinking about consciousness. Dan Dennett already had a book from back in the 1960s on consciousness. Nagel's famous article from the 70s, Jackson's and Levine's work on the knowledge argument, the explanatory gap from the 80s. Bill Lycan actually had a book, came out in 1988. Patricia and Paul Churchland. On the science side, people like Bernie Bars, Ray Jackendorf, Larry Weisskranz, Petra Sturek were working away, mostly at the level of articles. Although to be fair, 1988, I think the 2 classic books by Bernie Bars and Ray Jackendorf came out. And before long, though, in my period as a grad student, it went from early, 1988 or so, not very much, to by the time 92, 93, when I finished, came around, Crick and Koch had published their extremely important statement on neuroscience and consciousness, and there were books by Roger Penrose, Dan Dennett, Gerald Edelman, and others that were extremely important in founding the field. So it was, by the time I finished, it was a dead subject no longer, and I didn't have very much to do with that. That was all these people who really deserve a lot of credit. So it was a few years, but about 3 years in, it was time to really sit down and write my thesis on this topic. Writing doesn't come that easily to me, it turns out. So it was a long period of just sitting and staring at a blank screen. I did manage to dig through my files and find the first paragraph of my first attempt at writing this dissertation that turned into my book. So here it is. It's a file called First Try, which says, thesis, go. Consciousness is a big problem. Okay, still working on the formulation. A big problem. Take it from me. We don't have a clue about it. Without it, life sucks. Ain't that a bummer? Okay, so this is typical of the early stages of my writing process, but it eventually went somewhere, and by a year or so later, I had a PhD thesis called "Toward a Theory of Consciousness," which was I think I defended it actually in May of 1993. That was already very close to what eventually turned into The Conscious Mind. Here's the contents of it was called Toward a Theory of Consciousness, but the chapter structure, you'll see, is very, very similar to The Conscious Mind. I mean, the titles and sections more or less correspond. I mean, if you're a real connoisseur of the book, you might be able to recognize one or two small variations, but it's basically the first 7 chapters of The Conscious Mind and precedes of 3 potential chapters to come. So this is already quite close to what turned into The Conscious Mind. I spent the next 3 years, I was on postdoc in St. Louis, and refining. I submitted it for publication, refined it, and tried to circulate some of the ideas. The biggest thing to happen during that 3-year period for me, and for many people, was the first Tucson conference on consciousness in April of 1994, which I just submitted something to, hoping to give a poster, but Stuart Hameroff, who was organizing it, saw something in what I had and put me in the first session, along with 2 very distinguished philosophers, Owen Flanagan and Alvin Goldman. I had a hard time finding this schedule on the web. I put in some of the titles and so on. It turns out the only place, one of the very few places where you can actually find this schedule on the web anymore, is on the CIA website. The CIA is really into issues about consciousness. We've got CIA.gov reading room where they have the program of this conference. Actually, a few years later, in the year 2000, I actually gave a talk at the CIA in Virginia on some of these issues, on the science and philosophy of consciousness. And I have no idea what they made of that, but yeah, it turns out they're interested in all this. And yeah, I just gave a talk on explaining consciousness, where I mentioned the hard problem of consciousness, and somehow that thing immediately resonated with the audience at this conference, and immediately spread a whole lot further. It's a very powerful meme, it turns out. John Horgan wrote an article for Scientific American on the conference. That led to me writing my own article for Scientific American, where I introduced this phrase, the hard problem, on the first page. Also, the Journal of Consciousness Studies ended up running a symposium on some of those ideas with this article facing up to the problem of consciousness, where I talked about the easy problems and the hard problems, and there was a symposium on this. So this was all happening at about the same time. Around this time, it was building up this whole hard problem thing was building up a head of steam, and I was like, on the other hand, I was really waiting for this book to come out, which I viewed as the serious part. Really trying to do this in a philosophically serious way, and the hard problem without the conscious mind for me would have been kind of like the dessert without the main course. So I was impatient for the book to come out. I also needed to work on a title, though, for the book. The press told me they thought "Toward a Theory of Consciousness" was not a very exciting title. So I started coming up with a list of titles, which I'd circulate to friends and colleagues and say, what would be a good title for this book? And here are a few of my candidates. Well, there's "Toward a Theory of Consciousness." Taking Consciousness Seriously ended up being the title of the preface. Consciousness, a non-reductive manifesto. It's like a rousing. From quarks to qualia. Okay, there wasn't that much physics in the book, and so on. This was just the beginning. Foundations of consciousness, irreducibility of experience. At some point, I hit on this conscious mind idea, but I thought this is kind of boring. The conscious mind. Maybe it needs something. The enigma of the conscious mind. Reflections on the conscious mind, tapestries of the conscious mind, landscapes of the conscious mind, but I don't know, none of them really work. So, I had some other ideas with the titles tied to experience, subjective experience, My favorite was perhaps the William Blake title, Songs of Supervenience and Experience. I mean, why not? Once More with Feeling, Dancing Qualia and Zombie Dreams, The Fire Inside, and so on. Okay, I mean, I had fun with this, but ended up going with the boring backup title, The Conscious Mind, in search of a fundamental theory. And yeah, the title is kind of Siri. The other title, it's okay. Trevor title is getting in there. Yeah. It thinks it's a message to Trevor Title, who is a philosopher at Stanford University, whose name is rather unfortunately former student of mine. Don't ever mention the word title in your talk, or it will think it's Trevor. Okay. Yeah, the conscious mind in search of a fundamental theory, and the subtitle got at something important, which I'll get to in a moment. But okay, the book came out in April '96, just in time for the second Tucson conference, and then things happened from there, and there was a lot of reactions and a lot of controversy, and it was a great experience for me to suddenly be in the thick of all these discussions, which ended up actually going interesting places. Okay, so let me just say a little about the book itself. One interesting question is the relationship between this book and the hard problem. I mean, some people identify them as, the main thing about the book is the introduction of the hard problem. That when you're thinking about one, you're thinking about the other. It's not really how I think about it. I mean, there's probably a germ of truth in it. But one interesting question is, does anyone know how many times anyone got any guesses about how many times the phrase hard problem occurs in the conscious mind? Okay, Tobias says 10, Keith says 0, Johannes says 2, any others? Okay. Johannes is right. It's mentioned twice in the conscious mind. I wasn't going to mention it at all. The hard problem was already a thing by the time this book was coming out. It was like, well, you've got to connect them. I thought, no, it'd be really cool not to mention the hard problem at all and leave people to figure that out. And that seemed in the end just a little bit self-stultifying or something. So I ended up mentioning it twice, but it's only in the preface of the book that it gets mentioned. Many books and articles. Often such work addresses what might be called the easy problems of consciousness. These are important questions, but to answer them is not to solve the hard problem. Why is all this processing accompanied by an experienced inner life? And then a little later in the introduction, this might be seen as a great divide in the study of consciousness. If you hold that an answer to the easy problems explains everything that needs to be explained, you get one sort of theory. If you hold there's a further hard problem, in quotes, then you get another. After a point, it's hard to... Okay, so those are... So I thought, okay, well, that at least provides the connective material, but in the rest of the book, the phrase doesn't occur at all. Of course, the ideas are very much front and center. Questions about the distinctive difficulty of explaining consciousness are central. But nonetheless, I think of these as slightly separate streams of ideas and articles. Think of this as here's like a cheat sheet for deciphering this, at least as I think about it. I mean, on the one hand, there's this book that we're explicitly here to talk about, the conscious mind. On the other hand, there's this thing, the hard problem, which was the explicit topic of those two papers I mentioned already, facing up to the problem of consciousness and the puzzle of conscious experience, and then a couple of papers that came after that, like moving forward on the problem of consciousness. I mean, I think of the conscious mind is primarily for philosophers. It's full of a lot of philosophical details. I did write it in a way that I hoped many other people would be able to read as well, but this is it was very early in my career. I wanted to get the philosophy right, and this was primarily, I thought of it as a philosophical work. The hard problem papers, on the other hand, were really primarily aimed at expressing ideas in this vicinity for scientists interested in consciousness, for people outside philosophy, science, outside academia, entirely who were engaged by consciousness. And I thought of these papers as trying to engage those issues. I mean, the key memes are really quite different throughout. If you say, in the sense of what are the ideas from these works that actually caught people's imagination and got passed on? Well, I guess the conscious mind, I guess it has to be zombies. Right? Zombies, in the hard problem papers, the key idea is the hard problem. I already noted that in the conscious mind, the phrase hard problem hardly occurs. In the hard problem paper, at least in the original one, facing up to the problem of consciousness, the term zombies, I think, never occurs, and they play a very, very minimal role in that paper. And correspondingly, the main arguments of these works are actually somewhat different. I mean, the key argument against materialism, at least in the conscious mind, is the conceivability argument. Zombies are conceivable, so possible, and therefore materialism is false. The key argument in the hard problem paper, conceivability argument, plays little explicit role. The main argument is what I call the explanatory argument, that basically physical processes only explain structure and function. Roughly, the easy problems, to explain structure and function does not suffice to explain consciousness. Solving the easy problems doesn't solve the hard problem. Therefore, physical processes only explain structure and function, so physical processes don't explain consciousness. I mean, I like that argument. I think in some ways it's actually dialectically stronger than the conceivability argument, but it's a different argument. The key aim of the conscious mind was really to lay out the philosophical foundations of these issues and ideas about consciousness, the metaphysics, the epistemology, the semantics. To really, it wasn't so much intended to try and convince people as just to try and to understand the key philosophical and scientific issues. While the hard problem papers, I think of them as they were more in some ways dialectical, trying to make a very simple and powerful challenge to the reigning materialist and reductive orthodoxy in as simple and powerful a form as possible. And I think in some ways, actually, the hard problem arguments are dialectically stronger than the zombie arguments, but at the same time, the zombie arguments really turn out to be very philosophically rich in understanding the roots of these ideas. The key conclusion of them is both. The key conclusion of both the book and the articles is roughly I think of as, we need what I call a fundamental theory of consciousness, something which goes beyond straight orthodox physicalist ontology to either bring in consciousness as fundamental or something new as fundamental in the context of a fundamental theory that involves fundamental laws that, okay. So Siri doesn't understand, but the new Siri, which uses Claude Mythos Fable, maybe we'll understand. Siri right now is not even powered by Gemini, right? So it's who's to say? The key positive conclusion of both was we need fundamental theory that takes consciousness as fundamental, has fundamental principles connecting consciousness with the physical and functional domain, and that's what we ought to try and find, both as a general project, and then in both these works I advocated some specific principles for a psychophysical theory that I thought would be ought to be front and center. That said, I don't want to be too prescriptive about, say, the contents of this conference. I think not just the conscious mind, but the hard problem papers basically can be viewed as in spirit part of a single broader work. In my next book on consciousness, The Character of Consciousness, I started with those ones, the hard problem paper and these articles on the science of consciousness and on the neural correlates of consciousness. And I think all that ought to be seen as more or less fair game for this conference before that book ends up going in some different directions. The key concepts in the book, I tried making a word cloud of the book, but it turns out it just some really boring words ended up being far too front and center, like state and property and, supervenience. But a key idea of the first chapter, the hard problem, the two concepts of mind. Chapter 2 is where a lot of the really detailed philosophy gets done. And I know we have a lot of scientists and so on here, so maybe I'll skip over chapter 2. 3 is where zombies come in. 4 is where the conceivability argument comes in. 5, we get to issues about phenomenal judgment, tied to what I'd now call the meta problem, with ideas about phenomenal concepts. 6, 7, and 8 are moving in a more positive direction, ideas about structural coherence and the NCC, the neural replacement arguments, information, panpsychism, and 9 and 10, issues about conscious AI and quantum mechanics. And, people say that with any long book, no one reads the whole book. Usually they read the first couple of chapters if you're lucky. I mean, I've been lucky that, I think a lot of people get at least as far as chapter 4 in reading this, skipping a lot along the way. Does anyone ever make it to chapter 9 and chapter 10? I don't know. But a lot of these ideas have at least had their time in the sun. Has to be said, look, the conscious mind is not a wildly original work. All of these ideas are ideas that have been discussed by many philosophers, scientists, and other thinkers over the years. I mean, there is nothing at all original about the hard problem, apart from the particular phrase. Turns out to be very catchy, but Descartes was kind of in the vicinity. Leibniz's mill argument is right there. By the time you get to Huxley in the 1860s on the djinn, it being how the brain produces consciousness is as mysterious as the djinn, that's really the hard problem right there. The very first article of Tom Nagel's paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, is consciousness is what makes the mind-body problem really difficult. So, I mean, come on, there's the hard problem. Zombies, likewise, not as widespread, but Robert Kirk had a classic article from the 1970s. Keith Campbell, G.F. Stout mentioned them, though not for the purposes of arguing against materialism. In the 20s, Ned Block had all these absent qualia arguments, which were basically functional zombies. There are anti-materialist arguments in the vicinity, Kripke, Jackson, Martina. There is the 2D semantics had plenty of predecessors. Neural replacement arguments have got them. Theories of consciousness, a lot of them already out there by the 1990s, and all these other things, panpsychism, information, meta problem, strong AI, all of them have antecedents. So whatever the contribution of the conscious mind is, it's not to introduce some wildly new thesis that no one had encountered before. What is I don't know really what the contribution is, but maybe it's something about, for me, it was something about doing it right, giving versions of these ideas that, for me at least, were especially powerful, and which maybe could help you understand how a bunch of seemingly very disparate issues could be linked together. So part of it was to draw out those philosophical foundations and to do things right. But part of it, I also think, is that I don't see the project of the conscious. I mean, some people think about this book and primarily identify it with, that's the place where there are some arguments against materialism. That's a primarily negative thesis with a destructive role. That's not, I mean, that does happen in the conscious mind, but that's not what I think as the central aim. For me, the central project of the conscious mind is to find a theory of consciousness. We're all in this process of finding a theory of consciousness, and I always wanted to say this kind of theory, reductive theories, is not going to work for systematic reasons, but there's another kind of theory, non-reductive or fundamental theories, that has a hope of working. And I view that as kind of the fundamental conclusion, that we ought to be finding fundamental theories. And I see that very much as a part of a constructive project, not a destructive one, that we're aiming to find non-reductive theory. And maybe this was the place where the spirit of what I was doing differed a little bit from people like Kripke and Jackson, maybe even Martina, who were at that point putting forward arguments against materialism, but weren't so much interested in the character of a positive theory. I mean, by now Martina's got a whole wonderful book on this coming out coming out any day now, right? Yeah, so maybe back then all the people like putting forward theories were on the materialist side or the reductionist side. It's like, hello, half the world is maybe non-reductionist about consciousness. That shouldn't lead us to throw up our hands and say it's a big mystery. That should lead us to try and formulate a different kind of theory. So that's what I see as the distinctive spirit of the book and really the project. I've always seen it as a positive book, not a negative one. And that's, I think, the spirit in which hopefully it's come to be taken across time. Okay, let me say something about the last 30 years. What's changed since 1996? Where have we gotten to on some of these issues? Okay, so what's happened since 1996? Well, first question, hard problem? Did we solve it? No, still hard. You knew that. No solution to the hard problem has achieved any kind of consensus status in the field. There have been a lot of ideas and a lot of progress and a lot of cool thoughts and frameworks for addressing the hard problem, but I think it's fair to say that nothing is remotely close to a consensus here. Because there's some people who think there's no hard problem. That's always been the case. Way back in that passage from the introduction, I said it's about 2 or 3 to 1, as in most people, people who believe there's a hard problem versus people there's not, maybe 2 or 3 to 1 in favor of a hard problem. We have data about that now from the Phil Papers surveys, at least among professional philosophers. Is there a hard problem of consciousness? Yes or no? 62% of people say yes, 30% of people say no. So closer to 2 to 1. And who's to say? Maybe there are various biases there. I think it seems like something like that is still the case. But there are a lot of cool ideas, both coming out of the science and coming out of the philosophy. One way to come at this is to look at the kind of the structure and the history of the field across time. And now I'm kind of switching from this navel-gazing focus on my own work to this focus on the state of the field as a whole. In a couple of recent presentations, I've tried to think about the structure of the science of consciousness decade by decade. Maybe Johannes saw a version of this. I mean, some people talk about the science of consciousness as really being regenerated in the 1990s with Crick and Koch and other associated ideas. I think of it really as at least going through the warm-up phase in the 1970s and especially the 1980s through the study of conscious and unconscious processes, conscious and unconscious perception, implicit, explicit, memory and learning. But there's really a very large literature already. 1990s, the neural correlates of consciousness become an especially big thing, thanks especially to the work of Crick and Koch and Logothetis and others. By the 2000s, theories of consciousness start to become a big deal. I mean, all these things were around previously, but they became a major topic in the 2000s. You got, the GNWT, neuronal global workspace theory, IIT, various other theories, given their most influential formulations. 2010s, it turns out it's non-trivial to box everything into a decade, and sometimes the years don't quite align right. But maybe states of consciousness, including both altered states of consciousness in patients with disorders of consciousness, and states of consciousness, or contents of consciousness more generally, like states of visual consciousness. 2020s, what's the biggest thing? I don't know, at least from my perspective. The biggest thing, at least right now, middle of the decade, seems to be issues about the distribution of consciousness, that's consciousness in animals, in infants, in AI systems, in patients, and so on. So the distribution of consciousness has become very central. 2030s, I don't know, any bidders? I was thinking maybe Johannes might want to advocate for mathematical theories of consciousness, and there are plenty of other ideas out there. So that's how and I think in every case, once these ideas get on the table, they stay on the table and they stay a major focus. But how much does all this bear on the hard problem and on fundamental theories? I think of all of these, all of them at least connect to it, but the place where really the science has the potential to make a major contribution on those issues, I think lies especially with theories of consciousness. The hard problem is all about explaining consciousness, and the conscious mind is all about trying to find theories. So now we actually have detailed and articulated theories of consciousness, and even the theories that we had in the 1990s already, like global workspace and higher order thought, have been articulated in a whole lot more detail. So I think that's a really major form of progress. We now have detailed, reductive and non-reductive, scientific and philosophical theories of consciousness. And whatever you think about those theories, I think, again, none of them has achieved consensus as the correct theory or the theory that solves the hard problem, and so on. Nonetheless, I think we've made major progress simply through having had those theories articulated. And the same is true for, for example, global neuronal workspace theory, higher order thought theory. I don't think either of those things have transformed the philosophical situation since the 1990s, but we have much better articulated versions of both. On the other hand, I think in some ways, more closely connected to progress on the hard problem comes from issues like integrated information theory actually offers us what looks like a truly fundamental theory of consciousness, which explicitly takes consciousness as fundamental and tries to articulate certain fundamental principles involving consciousness as corresponding to maximums of phi, which is mathematical measure of integrated information. So that's, IIT is very exciting from the perspective of, say, the conscious mind. In fact, in chapter 8 of the conscious mind, I said maybe we ought to be articulating our theories of consciousness in terms of information via this double aspect principle of information. Structures of information can be realized physically or experientially, and maybe there's some mapping that say when one happens, the other happens. But I said for this idea to work, we're going to need some mathematical details, and I had none of those in the conscious mind. So you can see, from that perspective, you can see IIT is trying to provide, a mathematically precise version of that kind of idea with some mathematically precise principles. So that's very exciting from my perspective. At the same time, of course, there's a lot about IIT which is controversial, and my own view is there's not terribly much actual empirical evidence for it, and the philosophical case for it is also, could be stronger. Also, not entirely clear it's well defined as a psychophysical theory, because principles for connecting IIT structures to physics on the one hand and to phenomenology on the other hand are less clear than they could be. Nonetheless, I do take it this is super important progress on the hard problem to have a mathematically precise theory articulated, and I hope that in the next 10 or 20 years we'll have a whole lot more. Another one is the attention schema theory, which is the specific theory is Graziano's, but I take it to be an instance of a kind of debunking approach to consciousness, where we don't take consciousness as something which is real, but we take our judgments about consciousness as something which is real and try and explain those in terms of certain attentional structures. This is an instance of what we now think of as the illusionist structure. And then again, that's become an extremely important way of addressing the hard problem from more of a debunking or deflationary perspective. I should also mention the All-Coar theory, Hameroff and Penrose, which is explicitly, again, a fundamental theory of consciousness. Not as many details as IIT, but still interesting in many ways. At the same time, there's been progress in the philosophy of consciousness. Again, we can do a decade-by-decade structure over the years. It'll be slightly artificial again. But in the 1960s, we all associate with the mind-brain identity theory, Smart, Place, Armstrong, and others. Consciousness is identical to a brain process. 1970s, we associate with functionalism, Putnam, Lewis, and others. 80s and 90s become a little bit tricky, but I've got the 1980s. Collectively, they're the era of anti-materialist arguments, and property dualism began to be explored. Now, in the time since then, I think, in the first period of reaction to some of these anti-materialist arguments gradually led to the development of what's now known as the phenomenal concept strategy, type B, materialism, which is the strategy for identifying consciousness with brain states in face of the hard problem and the various explanatory gaps. Along the way, panpsychism emerged as a very serious philosophical theory, partly through the work of people like Galen Strawson and Philip Goff and Hedda Merck, who's right here. And that's become a very exciting area of activity for fundamental theories, probably the most popular way of developing fundamental theories of consciousness philosophically these days. And there's connected work on idealism, Russellian monism, and so on. And now we're in age where there's actually many robust versions of illusionism have been developed, partly thanks to the work of, much of it with its roots in the work of Dan Dennett, who has articulated various forms of illusionism over the decades. But in the actually 10 years or so ago now, Keith articulated illusionism explicitly as a philosophical framework. And now we've got to the point where actually, I believe just this week, Francois Camera published his book articulating a really detailed and in-depth and powerful illusionist framework, House of Mirrors, Illusionism. What's the subtitle, Francois? House of Mirrors, the illusion of phenomenal consciousness. So we're in an exciting time for illusionism right now, and I really see the development of, say, panpsychism on the one hand as a realist, fundamental theory of consciousness, and illusionism on the other hand as a debunking approach to consciousness. There's two places where we've had very major progress on these issues about theories and both fundamental and debunking theories of consciousness. 2030s, I don't know, any candidates for what's back to the identity theory? Back to my favorite theory. Maybe structuralism is. We've got some seeds of structuralism. Some people are going to vote for idealism here. Back to substance dualism, maybe. Martina's book advocates that in great depth. And then we have these specific philosophical theories of consciousness, of which these are on the side of relatively reductionist or deflationary approaches. We've got the various forms of illusionism I mentioned by Dan Dennett, Keith, Francois, and others. Type B materialism and the phenomenal concept strategy got developed in depth. Brian Law, Kati Barlog, David Papineau, and others. Panpsychism, I mentioned, Goff, Strawson, Hedda. And there's also various idealists in the vicinity. Helen Yetter-Chappell has a nice book on idealism, just appeared. And there's been a resurgence of work on various forms of property and substance dualism. Martina's book, Conscious Individuals, I think will be the definitive statement of this kind of view in the near term. But Kelvin McQueen has done work connecting it to dualism to quantum mechanics, some of which I've co-authored with him. I think Johannes I think of as a dualist deep down still. I know you love to be ecumenical, but one of these days his mathematical theory version of dualism is going to appear. So again, major progress in all of these ideas in articulating these alternatives and spelling out details. None of them have actually solved the hard problem, but it's helped us make progress in figuring out what else we need to do. So I think of all this as dividing into a few classes. There's a few fundamental theories, like IIT and Orko-R on the scientific side, panpsychism, idealism, dualism on the philosophical side. On the debunking side, we've got the attention schema theory. We've also got the work of people like Dan and Keith and Francois on specific illusionist theories, really trying to debunk our intuitions about consciousness in some ways. Global workspace theory and other functionalist theories, for them, I always think the focus for those is not the hard problem. It's not even phenomenal consciousness. Global workspace theory, in the first instance, is a theory of access consciousness that some people try to extend to a theory of phenomenal consciousness by making further claims. But it's not really the primary aim of those theories. And other theories like higher order thought, RPT, maybe the type B views, can be viewed as theories, gappy theories in the sense that they acknowledge at the very least an epistemic gap, or some of them do, between the relevant processes, recurrent processes, and consciousness. But they say there's at least a strong correlation between the two that might be filled eventually by some further thesis. Okay, let me just, in the final moment, say something about looking forward and where things could go from here. Part of this can be viewed as in the lens of taking these theories of consciousness and what would be required to get from where we are on these current theories of consciousness to having something that had a chance of building a consensus on these views as the correct theory of consciousness. Or maybe that's too much to hope for in the near term, but at least as really developing them into as robust a theory as possible, where the fundamental theories are concerned. I mean, for each of these theories, there's a question of really spelling these out in depth and detail, and really integrating with the scientific details as well as with philosophical issues. And most of them, some of them are already spelled out in that way, but certainly not all of them. Where fundamental theories are concerned, especially dualism or panpsychism, if you're a dualist, the big issue has always been the interaction problem. If consciousness is distinct from the physical realm, how does it play a causal role? There's a few ideas about that. Hedda was just was articulating some interesting new ideas about that to me just last week. Maybe there are ideas and for panpsychists, there's the combination problem. I've always said if you can actually solve the combination problem for panpsychism in a rigorous way, it immediately becomes the leading theory of consciousness. For debunking theories like illusionism, I see the situation similar but slightly different. I mean, for me, the big challenge for a debunking theory for illusionism is to say, well, if illusionism was true, the intuition is, if illusionism was true, being conscious, being a human being would be nothing like this. It would be phenomenologically blank. But in fact, things are not phenomenologically blank. Maybe we lack complete insight into our phenomenology, but being human is not phenomenologically blank. So I've always felt if an illusionist theory could solve the phenomenological problem is showing how if you're an illusionist, the world is not phenomenologically blank for you. You can tell a story about why it's not dispositionally blank and why you're led to make various judgments that it's not phenomenologically blank, but I've always felt like there needs to be a new idea in there somehow to really solve the phenomenological problem. Now, I haven't read all of Francois' new book, and maybe if I read that, I'll become convinced that there's a solution to this problem, or maybe we'll have to think about it some more. Functional theories, they're wonderful, but there's a question, how do you extend them to phenomenal consciousness? How really do you rigorously extend global workspace theory to phenomenal consciousness? That takes a whole lot of work. Gappy theories, we've got to find some way to either on the one hand remove the gap, so there's no longer an explanatory gap in these theories, or take that gap and acknowledge it honestly by postulating it as something like a fundamental bridging principle. And that's, I think, it's an approach you can take for all of these gappy theories in trying to get to a fundamental theory of consciousness. For all the theories, we've got to integrate with scientific details. There's also, of course, the possibility of new theories, unlike any of these theories that we haven't yet thought about. And maybe they're going to say, well, back in the 2020s, they were just stuck on this kind of theory and this kind of theory. But in fact, there's this other special kind of, special new kind of theory that solves the problem while avoiding all of these issues. And I'm very, very much open to new theories, so I'm hoping that we're going to get some of those here. One way to think about the research program for the kind of theory I like, fundamental theories, but which I think has a very broad range of applications, is to basically try and solve what my colleague David Bourget has called the mapping problem. This basically corresponds to what Anil Seth has called the real problem of consciousness. I mean, I think that's unnecessarily ideological as a phrase, but I think the problem is important. The mapping problem is the problem of finding systematic mappings from physical states to phenomenal states, maybe articulated in mathematical or structural terms. This is all at the level of correlation, at least initially, but then you want to find mappings of increasing breadth, simplicity, and strength, as we do in general in trying to find laws of nature. But we try to find psychophysical mappings of increasing breadth, simplicity, and strength, with the aim that once we have mappings which are optimal in their breadth, simplicity, and strength, we can then postulate a fundamental law, a fundamental psychophysical principle. And the hope is that might end up being ultimately something very simple. I've appealed to the idea that maybe eventually we'll have psychophysical laws so simple you might write them on the front of a T-shirt. Maybe that's a lot, again, to hope for, but I think there is a clear research program here, which is one that many people can take part in. One thing that's worth noting is the mapping route to a theory of consciousness is consistent with many views of the underlying metaphysics. It's consistent with the kind of naturalistic property dualism I like, where the mappings are ultimately construed as fundamental psychophysical laws. But it's also consistent with type B materialism, which appeals to certain identities between brain processes and consciousness. It just takes those mappings. It says, where there is a maximum of phi, there's consciousness, or where there's this activity in prefrontal cortex, there's consciousness, and calls them identities rather than laws. Or another view of type B materialism calls them grounding principles rather than laws of nature. I mean, there's a lot to say philosophically about the choice between all of those, but from the point of view of building a theory of consciousness, I think they can all be seen as somewhat similar. They're all going to involve epistemically primitive psychophysical principles which could get cashed out as laws, identities, or grounding. And I think all of these theories can be understood as, or at least consistent with the project of seeing them as mapping theories. IIT is already most explicitly in that form. Some of these, RPT, global workspace, could at least be extended into having that form. I think the exception here is illusionism, which is not realist about phenomenal consciousness. They, of course, can build mappings from brain states to judgments about consciousness and to the illusion of consciousness, but that's really a somewhat different project. But I think if anyone is on the realist side of this divide that takes consciousness seriously in the way that I articulate, I think ought to be open to something like this. And of course, we can hope that eventually we will find something deeper. This principle, what I see the fundamental theories, takes consciousness maybe as fundamental, takes these laws as fundamental, but we can always hope for something deeper that will somehow explain the laws, explain the principle, maybe neutral monism, grounding in some neutral X that's responsible for both physics and consciousness. Who's to say? Now, this mapping route may require solving a whole lot of individual problems along the way to get a convincing theory of consciousness. We're going to have to solve the description problem, finding a really good characterization of phenomenal states, perhaps in mathematical terms. There are projects now in mathematical and structural approaches to phenomenology or qualia that's very relevant. We're going to have to solve the evidence problem, get a better line on how we can rigorously get evidence for phenomenal states. I think of the work on tests that Liad and others are doing recently is very relevant here. There's the philosophical interaction problem. If we're going to have these fundamental entities, how can they play a causal role with respect to the physical world? Maybe, depending on the version of this problem, you have to solve the meta problem, or the combination problem, or the access problem, or the unity and binding problem. I mean, finding a fundamental theory of consciousness is not trivial. But as far as I can tell, there's a research program here which is, in principle, tractable, that we can solve without having to do the kind of, the sleight of hand that's involved in theories that try to avoid the hard problem entirely. This is the kind of theory which can acknowledge the problem and still lead to ultimately to a fundamental theory. I think I'm running out of time. I was going to say just a little bit about issues going forward about AI. I mean, this is the other big issue right now in 2026, which has led a lot of people to worry about consciousness and has brought consciousness to the center of many discussions, is whether AI systems generally or large language models specifically can be conscious. And a lot of people have been drawn into this debate, which is going to, turns out, it's probably going to be very, very important in figuring out how we ought to relate to AI systems in the coming decades. If they're conscious, then they may potentially have moral standing. We have to think about how we treat them. We have to think about their welfare. That's very different from the current situation where we think of them merely as tools. I mean, I do think there's a lot in the conscious mind which is very relevant here, some of it explicitly and some of it less explicitly. The first chapter of the conscious mind talks about, the double life of mental terms. For a given term like happiness or belief, there's a psychological way of understanding this purely as a functional process, and there's a phenomenal way, which is to have a state phenomenally like happiness or belief. I think now in the age of AI, we've actually gotten to a point where it's useful to see a triple life of mental terms, and in some work that I've been doing lately, I've advocated postulating words like quasi-belief or quasi-happiness in the first instance for systems which display behavior, which is behaviorally akin, interpretable as belief or happiness, or which plays the canonical functional role of belief or happiness, or which is experienced like belief or happiness. And I think having that three-way distinction is actually super useful for making sense of AI systems. The whole zombie notion, of course, is making a bit of a comeback. The conscious mind version was physical or functional duplicates without consciousness. The AI version is a situation many of us think we're in right now. We have behavioral near duplicates of humans. We have systems which are passing at least some simple Turing tests, but the consensus is, the most common view is that these systems are not conscious. I mean, that's controversial, but I think it is the consensus. So the consensus is we have extremely intelligent systems where behavior is involved, at least linguistic behavior, without consciousness. So it looks like, well, either they are conscious and we have conscious AI, shocking conclusion, or another very interesting conclusion, we have actually built behavioral zombies already. And it's interesting that zombies of this kind have gone from philosophical thought experiment to what many people take to be consensus fact. Various other conscious mind concepts are highly relevant to AI. I think solving the meta problem may give us our best purchase on consciousness in AI systems. That's something I've been arguing for lately. My own view is the neural replacement arguments are among the strongest arguments. In my view, maybe the single strongest argument for the possibility of consciousness in AI. If anything has the capacity to actually convince us that AI systems are conscious, it might be that the best way to do that is actually to become the AI system yourself through gradual replacement, and that maybe if people who do that say they're conscious along the way, it's going to be hard to tell them they're not conscious. Strong AI leads us to computational correlates of consciousness. This whole structural coherence program, mappings from structures in computation to structures in consciousness, is highly relevant. So I think there's a lot actually from this philosophical, scientific line of thinking about theories of consciousness, which we can bring to bear on the question of conscious AI. But okay, to end, I just want to advocate the possibility of new ideas. In what's going to happen in the next 30 years, I have no idea. It's good that I have no idea and that no one here knows. If we knew already, then that would kind of suggest that the progress we're going to make is going to be less than it could be. So I think there are sure to be many new ideas, new science, new theories, and of course, new solutions to the hard problem. I don't know what those will be, but I'm very much looking forward to seeing them. I'm hoping that maybe even we'll get some of these at this very conference. Maybe from the younger generation, Hedda or Francois or Johannes or Leonard, or let's just say who's to say from the it could be in among the poster presentations, the solution to the hard problem, maybe right there. Giulio Tononi was actually sitting there at the very first conference on consciousness in 1994, and I think he was just a postdoc, and he just gave a poster presentation. But yeah, who's to say? That was the idea that went on to become IIT. So I'm looking forward to either right here at this conference or in or in the halls of the science and philosophy of consciousness over the next decade or two to actually seeing these new ideas and seeing where they take us. And now I think we're in just a great position to get to work and see where all this goes. Thank you.